A federal case older than most marriages closes on the 12th of November 2021 in Cleveland, and nobody raises a hand to cuff anyone. No perp walk, no rights read aloud. The man 2 generations of a single Marshall family spent 52 years chasing has already been buried for 6 months, under a name the case file never once mentions. His picture went to every FBI field office in the country. It ran on national television twice. And for all 52 of those years, whenever agents looked, he was somewhere else. 2 questions drive everything that follows. How does a kid barely out of his teens dodge federal law enforcement for half a century? And having pulled it off completely, why throw the win away at the finish line? Begin at the beginning. It's the 10th of July, 1969, in Cleveland, and Ted Conrad turns 20 the same day he holds a job title that undersells itself completely. Vault teller, Society National Bank, right on Public Square. Counting it, carrying it, signing for it. That's the role. Across one ordinary week, more cash passes through his hands than most employees in that building will ever see. Nobody gives that kind of access to someone they're wary of. It goes to whoever the room already trusts. Easygoing. The guy who makes a dull shift feel shorter. Trust is the actual lock on that vault. Not a camera. Not a protocol. A year earlier, a movie titled The Thomas Crown Affair hits theaters. Steve McQueen is a wealthy, bored Bostonian who robs banks for the thrill and disappears without a scratch. Multiple people who knew Conrad say he watched it again and again, upward of 6 times. Not idle entertainment. Practice. Around this stretch, he starts telling coworkers, plainly and more than once, how vulnerable the place is. That a person could clear the building of everything in it and nobody would notice before the weekend ended. Every time, it gets a laugh. People joke about robbing their own workplace constantly. The joke stays funny only because the person telling it isn't supposed to mean it. Then comes Friday the 11th of July, 1969, right at closing. Conrad loads a paper grocery sack with cash. The number that's stuck ever since sits around $215,000, close to $1.8 million in current terms, and tops it off, according to one later account from a marshal, with a bottle of whiskey and a pack of cigarettes, the kind of cover a person uses so a neighbor won't ask questions about a heavy bag. There's no gun, no disguise. He simply walks out through the front doors, wishes coworkers a good night he knows is their last one with him, and steps into the Cleveland evening holding more money than several of them combined will make in a decade. Run the numbers the way he already has. 1969 means no digital ledger tracking the vault in real time. Someone counts it by hand, and nobody does that again until the branch reopens Monday. The instant that bag clears the threshold, he's bought roughly 62 hours where nobody is watching. 12 hours in, Saturday morning, quiet. 36 hours in, Sunday, quiet. Only Monday the 14th, once those 62 hours run out, does a coworker spot an empty station where a teller should stand. Nobody picks up at his apartment. The count doesn't add up, gets redone, still doesn't add up. By late morning, a manager on Public Square relays a dollar figure over the phone, and within the hour, the FBI opens a file and issues a federal warrant for Theodore John Conrad, 2510, last spotted in office clothes. Whichever agent catches the case first is already chasing a lead that's had days to cool. Here's the detail that separates this from a routine heist, Conrad writes. Over the following weeks, he mails his Ohio girlfriend a full account by hand. The confession, a declaration of love, and a plan. Federal embezzlement carries a 7-year clock, so the strategy is patience. Sit tight somewhere else. Resurface in 1976 at 27. Marry her as intended. Except mail requires a mailbox, and investigators already know whose mailbox to watch. Within weeks, they've made contact with her, and every letter folds into a case file that stays open for the next 5 decades. His own penmanship ends up doing more to locate him than any informant could. Back home, the file settles onto one desk and stays there for good. Deputy U.S. Marshal John Elliott inherits it the year it's opened, and his son Pete, who will eventually carry this exact case himself, later notes an odd coincidence. The 2 households shared a family doctor, And Conrad once scooped ice cream at a counter in their neighborhood. Worth remembering, because one Elliot is about to spend a career on this file, while the other, still a child at the family table, won't enter the story for years. By October, a Cleveland couple thinks they've spotted Conrad at a hotel bar in Honolulu. Agents pursue it island-wide before the trail evaporates within days. Proof that, 3 months in, the hunt nearly ended on a single bar stool. What Conrad doesn't know is that the ground had already shifted a month earlier, in September, when a grand jury in Cleveland hands down an indictment that quietly reroutes everything. The charge isn't robbery. Under the law, he was technically never a robber. It's embezzlement and falsifying records, money he'd been entrusted with, rather than stole by force. Smaller sounding, but it detonates his entire plan, because an indictment permanently stops that 7-year clock the moment a jury attaches a name to it. 27, 47, 80 years old. It no longer matters when he resurfaces. The charge simply waits. And an indictment isn't quiet. It lands in his hometown paper. Whatever wedding he'd imagined dies on that page, along with the homecoming. Her mailbox stays under watch. From September 1969 forward, Conrad isn't hiding anymore. He's serving an open-ended sentence, with himself as the only guard. What does it take to erase a person, a real one, with an actual face and a mother waiting on a phone call? The answer arrives in Boston, January 1970. A young man requests a fresh Social Security card under the name Thomas Randele. Birth date, July 10, 1947. Notice what he kept. The day, the month, untouched. Only the year moves, exactly 2 years earlier, and even his parents' real names stay on the form. Somebody erasing his mother, his sister, his hometown, and every photo of his real face still refuses to give up his actual birthday. That 2-year gap matters. Hold on to it. Of all the American cities available to vanish into, he chooses the one where the Thomas Crown affair was actually shot. Not fleeing the fantasy, walking straight into it. 1970 is an ideal crack to slip through, because identity verification then runs almost entirely on trust. State your name, receive a number. The number unlocks a license, the license unlocks credit, and credit unlocks work, housing, a car, a life. Each document simply vouching for the last one, nothing cross-referenced. Because the technology to catch a lie like this is generations away. Piece by piece, Thomas Randele becomes an identity the system itself certifies, resting on one false fact underneath. Somewhere in that gap, the Cleveland bank teller stops existing. 2 separate lives now unfold side by side for half a century. Back in Ohio, the case grows thicker with paperwork, while the Bureau airs the manhunt nationally, twice, each broadcast pulling leads from coast to coast. Out in Massachusetts, Thomas Randele works a country club job before settling into car sales, Volvos and Land Rovers, for nearly 40 years, moving vehicles to attorneys, surgeons, even police officers. On one golf outing with 3 officers, someone proposes $5 a hole. Randele waves it off. No gambler, he says. Across hundreds of rounds with working cops, he never takes that bet, because a man hiding from a federal warrant doesn't attach his name to money, not even in fun. Kathy becomes his wife in 1982. A daughter, Ashley, follows a few years after. Every additional year, the lie survives. The pile on top of it only grows. At one point, Kathy lays out brochures for a trip to France, and a passport would mean fingerprints on a federal application. Seconds of ink, capable of collapsing everything since 1970. He deflects. Someone needs to stay behind and watch the cat. Kathy chalks it up as another of Tommy's quirks, for nearly 4 decades of marriage. A DNA testing kit turns up once as a gift and never gets opened. Not once does he search his own name online. Back in Ohio sits a mother he won't phone, a sister he avoids, funerals he lets pass without him. At a different table across town, young Pete grows up with one recurring dinnertime question: any word on Conrad? By 1987, John Elliott is pinning deputy credentials on his own son. One household raises a hunter, the other, unknowingly, raises a daughter who has no idea what her real surname is. The strangest image in this whole account arrives next. Thomas Randele's face turns up in commercials for the dealership, an actively wanted federal fugitive standing under showroom lights, urging the regent to stop in. Somewhere in that same stretch, a 20-year-old Ted Conrad in a bank uniform is broadcast nationwide on a manhunt segment, while a grayer, heavier Thomas Randele pitches financing on local Boston airwaves. Conceivably the very same evening, viewers see the tip line number right there on screen. Every callback across every state gets checked, and not a single one says, "That's my car salesman." Buried beneath that success sits its own quiet undoing. Tucked in one of John Elliott's 20 binders is a page written in Conrad's own hand at 18. A college application from 1967. Faces change with time. Handwriting largely doesn't. Investigators are already sitting on half the proof they'll eventually need. All that's missing is a matching sample, someday, from Conrad himself. 21 years into the hunt, in 1990, John Elliott retires. And by every normal measure, that should be where this file goes quiet. It isn't. He keeps returning, signing in at the courthouse, sliding one of those 20 binders off its shelf, the spine worn soft from repeated handling. A younger deputy checks in one day, asking if anything's turned up. "Not yet," comes the reply. Not a flat no, but not yet, which after 15 years of retirement means he's still actively hunting. Modern tools like fingerprint databases, credit histories, and facial recognition all work by matching the present to a documented past. And Conrad's past was permanently sealed in 1970. None of that machinery has anything to compare him against. Only a fresh sample of his own hand could ever close that gap. Pete Elliott takes the oath as U.S. Marshal for Northern Ohio in 2003, saying later that the case stayed alive in the family purely out of loyalty to his father. Then in 2014, at a courthouse near Boston, Thomas and Kathy petitioned for bankruptcy protection over roughly $160,000 owed. An indicted fugitive puts his actual signature on a federal filing, a clerk stamps it without a second glance, and life moves on. Except the government has, unknowingly, just obtained a second handwriting sample to set beside that 1967 application, 47 years apart, both waiting to be compared. That bankruptcy filing also settles a lingering question. What happened to all that cash? It was gone within a decade, spent on poor investments and simply the cost of living an ordinary life. Most people misread its purpose entirely. The money was never meant to last. Its only job was purchasing the getaway itself. A room to disappear into, a ticket out, half a year of anonymity, while a new life took root. Everything that came afterward, the marriage, the house, the daughter, 4 decades of car sales, Randele built with his own labor, under a different name. 48 years on, in 2017, the case remains formally open, and investigators release a computer-aged rendering imagining what a once 20-year-old fugitive might look like at 68. Now in his 80s, John Elliott gives an interview containing the most direct line in this entire saga. That warrant belongs to him. He hasn't slept soundly, he admits, since 1969. He dies in March of 2020, 83 years old, buried with his badge as he'd requested. Near the end, his son vows they'll still bring Conrad in. And here the narrative flips entirely. The hunter is gone 14 months before his target, taking with him the last living memory of every page in that file. Pete inherits the drive to finish it, but drive alone isn't evidence. What he actually has is a stack of paper documenting 50 years of dead ends. At this exact point, the secret is airtight, because the promise keeping it alive has nothing left to chase. A year on, though, Conrad dismantles it himself. Why? In February of 2021, in Lynnfield, Massachusetts, doctors deliver an aggressive lung cancer diagnosis. Not one federal database or courthouse binder starts this final countdown. A single malignant cell does. And now there are exactly 2 paths left. Stay silent, and he dies as Thomas Randele, well-loved car salesman, funeral packed to capacity, the con complete and untouched forever. Except his daughter would go the rest of her life, never learning her true last name. Or he can finally hand over the one thing he's guarded since he was 20. March 2021, the Linfield living room, an episode of Nias playing somewhere behind them, wife and daughter both present. By Ashley's later telling, he brings it up almost casually, mentioning, in case it ever came up, that he'd once had to legally change his name. She laughs it off. It sounds like one of his usual jokes. Alone later that night, though, she searches it anyway, and what surfaces is an actual 1969 Cleveland bank case tied to an actual missing 20-year-old. The moment, in her words, everything turned genuinely unsettling. She confronts him, insists she has a right to know her own identity. His answer comes the next day. "I'm Ted Conrad." Ashley would describe her father, across his whole life, as unshakably calm. But that particular day, for once, fear showed on his face. And here's what finally settles this story's central question. He gives federal investigators absolutely nothing. No phone call to a marshal's office, no note to the bank, no attorney quietly probing for leniency, and none of that will ever change. The truth goes exclusively to the two people who've earned it, nobody beyond them. He passes away at home in May 2021 at 71, though mourners at his service believe him 73. The turnout stretches the length of the building. Clients, neighbors, golfing buddies, repeat customers, spanning 30 years. His widow sums him up publicly in 4 words: a great man. His printed obituary days afterward turns out to be this case's oddest surviving artifact, because it's entirely accurate. Correct month, correct day of birth. His parents listed under their genuine names. A man who legally didn't exist somehow gets a truthful biography in print, and to this day, nobody has explained why those real details were left in. The family reportedly plans on holding the secret for a full year before going public. That plan collapses almost immediately. That autumn, an anonymous sender, identity still unknown, something Ashley herself calls the last unresolved thread in this whole account, forwards that obituary to an Ohio true crime author already deeply familiar with the Conrad case. She spots the parents' real names instantly and passes it directly to Marshal Pete Elliott. From there, the hunt resolves exactly the way paperwork always promised it would. His father's binder yields the handwritten 1967 application. A Boston courthouse yields the 2014 bankruptcy signature. 2 samples 47 years apart, from men supposedly never connected. Set side by side, they show identical loops, identical slant, the same hand that wrote both, decades apart. Even the obituary's birth date is off by that same telling 2 years. The lone detail he wouldn't erase turns out to be the one that gives him away completely. 52 years, 20 case binders, leads chased down in every state, 2 national broadcasts, and 2 generations of one Marshall family. And the whole thing ends with a clipped newspaper notice and a pair of matching signatures. Marshals make the drive to Linfield, and what should be an arrest instead becomes a courtesy visit. Nobody's in trouble, they explain. They just need to talk. There's nothing left to enforce. A federal warrant only applies to the living, and this particular man has been 6 months in the ground. On the 12th of November 2021, Pete Elliott formally closes the case his father opened back in 1969, signing it in John K. Elliott's name, a deathbed promise, fulfilled through paperwork. Call that the government's version of victory. A name confirmed 6 months late, handed over voluntarily, printed in a dead man's own obituary, verified through his own handwriting, closed under a signature that isn't even his living son's. Marshals themselves admit as much. The case baffled investigators across 5 decades, and Conrad, as Pete Elliott put it, essentially lived out a fugitive's ideal existence. That framing matters, because a few other names likely already came to mind while watching this. D.B. Cooper leapt from a jet with $200,000 and became folklore, except a portion of that cash later surfaced decaying in a riverbed, unspent, meaning whatever he won, he never actually got to use it. Whoever cleared out the Gardner Museum in 1990 was never identified either, and those frames remain empty to this day. Yet the strongest suspects investigators named all died with nothing. Conrad's story ends differently from both. The theft succeeded completely. What followed was a real, lived life. Nearly 4 decades of marriage, a daughter, a genuine career, and general goodwill from strangers for years on end. No one ever laid hands on him, dead or alive, and every beat of the ending happened exactly as he chose it. His schedule, his living room, his own confession, delivered to his own family. Everyone else on that list settled for a partial win. He's the only one who walked away with the entire thing. Think about it. Someone once sold you a vehicle, or gave you a golf lesson, or shared a memory of the deceased while standing beside you at a wake. How confident are you, really, in the name they gave you? Federal investigators have surrendered this way before, formally, on paper, to a man they were never actually able to catch. And Ted Conrad wasn't the last one who managed it.